Imagine a room filled not with the joyful sounds of new life, but with a heavy and forced silence. Picture rows of cots, each holding a newborn baby. Their cries are not met with a mother's comforting embrace. Instead, they are often ignored, a sound to be stifled. The air is thick with unspoken sorrow. This was the reality for tens of thousands in Ireland. In these places, a mother's love was seen as a sin. Her touch was forbidden. Her natural instinct to care for her child was systematically broken. It was a place where the most fundamental human bond was treated as a source of shame, a transgression that had to be punished and erased from public view. These institutions were called mother and baby homes. The name sounds gentle, almost caring, but the truth is far darker. For the women and children inside, they were prisons. They were places of emotional and physical confinement. Young women, often just girls themselves, were sent there to hide their pregnancies. They were hidden from a society that could not tolerate the scandal of an unmarried mother. Their crime was not one of law, but of love. They were condemned not by a court, but by their own families, their neighbors, and their church. The walls of these homes were built with stone, but they were held together by shame and fear, locking away a generation of women and their innocent children. The silence in these homes was not just about the babies, it was about the mothers too. They were told not to speak of their past. They were ordered to forget the fathers of their children. They were instructed to give up their babies without a fight. Their identities were stripped away. They were no longer daughters, sisters, or individuals with dreams. They became simply fallen women, inmates in a system designed to punish them for their perceived moral failings. Their voices were silenced just as effectively as their babies' cries. The silence was a tool of control, a way to maintain order and enforce the cruel ideology that governed these homes. Think of the coldness of it all. A mother giving birth, often alone and terrified. Her baby is then taken from her arms, sometimes within hours. She might only be allowed to see her child during feeding times, her interactions strictly monitored. She is told she is unfit, that her child deserves a better life with a proper family. The emotional torment is difficult to comprehend. It is a wound that never truly heals. This was not a rare occurrence. It was a systematic practice, a calculated cruelty inflicted upon thousands of vulnerable women and their children. A past that Ireland is only now beginning to confront. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. The mother and baby homes were a network of institutions spread across Ireland. They were run primarily by Catholic religious orders, but they were supported by the state. They were a solution to what was seen as a major social problem: unmarried mothers. In the eyes of the church and society, these women had committed a grave sin. They brought shame upon their families and their communities. The homes were designed to contain that shame. They were places where these women could be hidden away, where their pregnancies and births could be managed out of sight. The goal was to maintain a facade of moral purity for the rest of the country. These were not hospitals or welcoming shelters. They were foreboding, austere buildings, often with high walls and locked gates. They looked and felt like prisons. Once a young woman entered, she was often cut off from the outside world. Her letters were censored. Her visitors were restricted if allowed at all. She was stripped of her name and given a new one, or referred to simply by her first name. This was the first step in breaking her spirit. It was a way of telling her that her old life was over. She was now an inmate, a penitent who had to work to atone for her sins. The walls were not just physical, they were emotional, isolating each woman in her own private world of grief. The stigma was immense. A girl who became pregnant outside of marriage faced total rejection. Her family, fearing the judgment of their neighbors, would often be the ones to send her away. The secret would be kept at all costs. The official story might be that she had gone to England to work, or was caring for a sick relative. The shame was so powerful that families were torn apart by it. Fathers disowned their daughters. Mothers turned their backs. Siblings were told to forget they ever had a sister. This societal pressure was the engine that kept the mother and baby homes full for decades. Inside, the women were constantly reminded of their fallen status. The nuns who ran the homes often subjected them to relentless humiliation. They were called names. They were told they were worthless. They were lectured on their sinfulness. The psychological abuse was relentless. It was designed to make them feel grateful for the shelter they were given, even as they were being treated inhumanely. They were made to believe that they deserved the punishment they were receiving. This constant reinforcement of shame was a powerful tool of control, ensuring that few would dare to speak out or resist the system that had imprisoned them. To understand the mother and baby homes, you have to understand the Ireland of the time. It was a country where the Catholic Church held enormous power. The Church's teachings on morality were not just guidelines, they were effectively the law of the land. Its influence reached into every aspect of life: politics, education, healthcare, and family. The state and the Church were deeply intertwined. This created a culture of deference and fear. To go against the teachings of the Church was to risk becoming an outcast. And there was no greater moral sin in this society than sex outside of marriage, especially when it resulted in a child. The pressure on young women was suffocating. From a young age, they were taught that their purity was their greatest virtue. The shame of a premarital pregnancy was considered absolute. It wasn't just a personal failing, it was a stain on the honor of the entire family. In small, close-knit communities, a secret like that was impossible to keep. The gossip and judgment would be relentless. Families believed their reputation, their standing in the community, and even their livelihoods were at stake. Sending a daughter away was seen as the only option to avoid public disgrace. It was a cruel calculation, born of fear. This system of judgment was not just informal social pressure, it was institutional. Doctors, police, and social workers all played a role. A local priest might be the first to be told of a girl's pregnancy. He would then advise the family, often strongly recommending that the girl be sent to a mother and baby home. A doctor might refuse to treat an unmarried pregnant woman, instead referring her to one of the institutions. The state, far from protecting these citizens, was complicit. It funded the homes and passed laws that made it easier to separate unmarried mothers from their children. It was a society-wide conspiracy of condemnation. The fathers of these children often escaped any public shame. The burden fell almost exclusively on the women. In many cases, the men were not held accountable. They were allowed to continue their lives as if nothing had happened. Some men did want to support the mothers of their children, but the system was designed to keep them apart. The women were told the men had abandoned them. The men were told the women wanted nothing to do with them. The authorities in the homes actively worked to sever any connection, ensuring the woman was left completely isolated and dependent on the institution. The double standard was stark and cruel. Life inside the homes was a regimen of hard labor and prayer. It was framed as penance, a way for the women to atone for their sins. But in reality, it was forced, unpaid labor that kept the institutions running. Upon arrival, women were put to work. They scrubbed floors on their hands and knees. They worked in industrial-scale laundries, washing sheets and clothes for local businesses, hospitals, and even government departments. The work was physically demanding, often for long hours, with little rest. They worked right up until they gave birth and were expected to return to their duties soon after. The conditions were harsh and unforgiving. The women were often malnourished, given just enough food to keep them working. Medical care was minimal, and in some cases, non-existent. Many women have given testimony of giving birth without any pain relief, attended by nuns with no medical training. They were told the pain of childbirth was part of their punishment, a penance they had to endure. The emotional cruelty was constant. They were treated not as expectant mothers needing care, but as inmates who had to earn their keep through suffering. The experience left deep physical and psychological scars. One survivor, Philomena Lee, whose story was made famous in a film, recalled the relentless work. She spoke of how the nuns would inspect their work in the laundries, punishing them for the smallest mistake. Another survivor described having to polish the same floor for hours, a pointless, repetitive task designed to break her will. These were not isolated incidents. This was the standard operating procedure in homes across the country. The women were a captive workforce, and their labor was profitable for the religious orders that ran the institutions. They were trapped in a cycle of exploitation, disguised as religious devotion. After giving birth, the women were often required to stay and work for a period of 1 to 3 years. This was their payment to the nuns for the care they had received. During this time, they might be allowed to care for their own child, but many were separated from them. Their babies were kept in a nursery, and the mothers might only see them for brief scheduled periods. This forced separation was agonizing. It also served a purpose to prevent a strong bond from forming between mother and child. This made the eventual, inevitable adoption easier for the institution to manage. The price of their sin was years of servitude and the loss of their child. The final, and for many, the most devastating act of cruelty was the forced adoption of their babies. The primary function of many of these homes was to procure babies for adoption, both within Ireland and abroad, particularly to the United States. The mothers were systematically coerced into signing adoption papers. They were told they had no choice. They were told they were selfish if they wanted to keep their child. They were told their child would have a better life with a good Catholic married couple. These women were young, isolated, and had been psychologically broken down for months. Resistance was nearly impossible. The process was shrouded in deceit. Many women were given documents to sign that they did not understand. Some were still groggy from childbirth or under medication. They were rushed, pressured, and given no time to think or seek advice. Some women have testified that their signatures were forged. Others were told they were signing papers for their child's temporary care, only to find out later that they had signed away all their parental rights forever. The consents obtained under these conditions were not consents at all. They were acts of coercion, carried out by people in positions of absolute power. The adoptions were often illegal. Birth certificates were falsified. The names of the birth mothers were removed, and the names of the adoptive parents were put in their place. This created a new, false identity for the child. It effectively erased the birth mother from her child's life story. This was done to ensure the adoption was permanent and that the mother could never trace her child. It also meant that the children grew up with no knowledge of their true origins, their medical history, or their Irish heritage. It was a secret that was meant to be kept forever, a lie written into official state documents. For the mothers, the loss was a life sentence of grief. After being forced to give up their babies, they were sent back out into the world, sworn to secrecy. They were expected to carry their trauma in silence, to pretend that their child never existed. Many never spoke of it to anyone, not even their future husbands or other children. They lived with a constant, gnawing emptiness. For the children, the adoptees, the discovery of their origins in later life was often a profound shock. They learned that their entire life story was built on a lie, and that their birth mothers had not given them up willingly, but had been forced to. The cruelty of the homes did not end with forced labor and forced adoptions. For thousands of children, their lives ended within the walls of these institutions. The mortality rates for infants in many mother and baby homes were shockingly high, far higher than the national average. A 2021 official report found that around 9,000 children died in the 18 institutions investigated. That is 1 in 7 of all the children who passed through them. They died from malnutrition, neglect, and preventable diseases like measles, gastroenteritis, and pneumonia. Their small bodies simply could not survive the harsh and unsanitary conditions. The most infamous example is the home in Tuam, County Galway, run by the Bon Secours nuns. For years, local people spoke of a children's graveyard on the grounds. In 2014, the work of a local historian, Catherine Corliss, brought the truth to light. She uncovered death certificates for almost 800 children who had died at the home between 1925 and 1961, but there were no records of their burials. Subsequent investigations revealed a mass grave, a structure that had once been a sewage tank filled with the remains of infants and young children. They had been buried without coffins, without ceremony, and without a name to mark their resting place. The story of Tuam horrified the world, but it was not unique. Other homes had similar secret graveyards, or angel plots. The children who died were often seen as disposable. Their deaths were not properly recorded. Their parents were often not even informed. They simply vanished. The nuns who ran the homes showed a shocking disregard for the lives of these little ones. In death, as in life, these children were treated as nameless and worthless, the offspring of sin, who did not deserve the dignity of a proper burial. The ground itself holds the evidence of this ultimate, unforgivable neglect. The discovery of these mass graves has been a moment of national reckoning for Ireland. It is the most tangible, horrifying proof of the system's inhumanity. How could a society, a state, a church allow this to happen? How could the deaths of thousands of babies go unnoticed and uninvestigated for so long? The Garden of Angels at Tuam, and other sites like it, stands as a silent testament to the children who were denied a life. It forces the country to confront the darkest corners of its past and the devastating human cost of its obsession with shame and secrecy. The entire system of mother and baby homes was built on a foundation of secrecy. It was a vast, collaborative effort to hide an inconvenient truth. The shame was so pervasive that everyone played a part in maintaining the silence. Families kept the secret of their disappeared daughters. Communities looked the other way. The state provided the funding and the legal framework, but rarely inspected the conditions inside. And the church, which held the ultimate moral authority, enforced the silence with the threat of eternal damnation. It was a conspiracy of silence that lasted for generations. This silence meant that the abuses could continue, unchecked, for decades. The women inside were powerless. They had no one to turn to. If they complained, they were not believed. They were punished for speaking out. The outside world did not want to know what was happening behind the high walls. Society had found a way to deal with the problem of unmarried mothers. And it was easier to pretend that the solution was a humane one. The silence protected the institutions. It protected the state. It protected the families. The only people it did not protect were the vulnerable women and children trapped inside. Even after the homes began to close in the latter half of the 20th century, the silence continued. The women who had been through the system were sworn to secrecy. They carried their trauma alone. They were afraid to speak out, fearing the stigma that still lingered. Many went to their graves without ever telling their story, without ever telling anyone that they had a child who had been taken from them. The state, for its part, sealed the records. Access to birth certificates and adoption files was made incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The silence was now official policy. It was the courage of survivors and the work of dedicated campaigners and historians that finally broke the silence. Women like Catherine Corliss refused to let the story be forgotten. Survivors began to find each other, to share their stories, and to realize they were not alone. They formed advocacy groups and demanded answers. They demanded access to their own records. They demanded that the state and the church acknowledge what had been done to them. Their bravery, after a lifetime of enforced silence, forced Ireland to begin a painful public conversation about its past. Their voices are the sound of the silence finally being broken. Despite the system's best efforts to sever the bond between mother and child, it could never be completely erased. For the mothers, the memory of their baby, however brief their time together, remained a powerful and permanent part of their lives. Many spent decades searching for their lost children. They wrote letters to adoption agencies, to government departments, to the religious orders that ran the homes. They were almost always met with a wall of silence. They were told the records were lost, or that they had no right to the information, but they never gave up hope. The search was often a lonely and frustrating journey. Philomena Lee spent 50 years looking for her son, Anthony. She was told by the nuns at the home that they knew nothing, that the records had been destroyed in a fire. In truth, they knew exactly where he was. He had been adopted by an American family and had become a successful lawyer. He, too, had searched for his mother, making several trips back to the very same convent, only to be told the same lies. They died without ever finding each other. Their story is a heartbreaking example of the deliberate cruelty of the system. For the adopted children, now adults, the search for their birth mothers was a search for identity. Many grew up feeling that something was missing. They wanted to know where they came from. They wanted to see a face that looked like their own. They wanted to understand the circumstances of their birth. The roadblocks put in their way by the state and the church were immense. The falsified birth certificates made tracing their origins nearly impossible. Yet, with the advent of DNA testing and the tireless work of support groups, some have found success. These reunions, when they happen, are incredibly powerful and emotional. They are a testament to the enduring strength of the bond between a mother and her child. They are filled with tears, with questions, and with the difficult process of understanding a shared history of loss and separation. But for every joyful reunion, there are thousands more who are still searching, or whose search ended in disappointment. The right to one's identity, to know your own story, is a fundamental human right. For decades, the Irish state denied this right to thousands of its own citizens, all in the name of secrecy. Today, the truth of Ireland's mother and baby homes is no longer a secret. The final report of the Commission of Investigation, published in 2021, laid bare the shocking scale of the abuse, neglect, and discrimination. It confirmed the stories that survivors have been telling for years. The Irish state has issued a formal apology, but for many survivors, an apology is not enough. They want justice, they want accountability, They want the religious orders that ran the homes to take full responsibility for their actions, and most of all, they want to ensure that this never, ever happens again. Remembering this history is not about dwelling on the past. It is about learning from it. It is about understanding how a society can allow such profound cruelty to happen in plain sight. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power, whether it belongs to the state or the church. It is a story about what happens when shame is weaponized and when compassion is lost. The suffering of these women and children must not be in vain. Their story must become a permanent part of Ireland's national memory, a lesson taught to every generation. The legacy of the mother and baby homes is still felt today. It is felt by the aging mothers who still grieve for the children they never knew. It is felt by the adoptees who are still searching for their identities. It is felt in the mass graves that are still being uncovered. Healing these deep wounds will take time, and it requires more than just words. It requires concrete actions, full access to records, proper memorials for the dead, and meaningful compensation for the survivors whose lives were stolen from them. It requires a commitment to listen to their voices. We have a duty to listen to these voices. We must honor the courage of the survivors who broke the silence. We must remember the 9,000 children who were denied a chance at life. We must promise them and ourselves that we will not look away. The story of the mother and baby homes is not just Irish history. It is a story about human rights and human dignity. By remembering it, by telling it, by refusing to let it be forgotten, we make a promise that we will stand up for the vulnerable, that we will challenge injustice, and that we will never again allow such a terrible silence to fall.